Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to take a second look at the Tamron 150 to 600 millimeter G2 lens. And last year, towards the latter part of the year, I did my review of the 150 to 600 G2. And at that point, because I had the lens for a fairly brief period, I had to focus my efforts on doing a full frame review, and also, as far as comparison, I had the original kind of Generation 1 lens on hand to compare with, and that was the extent of my overall comparisons. So anyway, out of that, there was a number of new requests that came in for me to do a few different things. One was to review the lens on APS-C. Another was to test how it actually performs with Tamron's new extenders. And then finally was to do a comparison with Canon's 100 to 400 millimeter f4.5 to 5.6 L Mark II, and using that with the Canon 1.4 times teleconverter on there. And so today what I'm going to do is a episode where I cover all three of those things. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually look at some images together, and so you can see for yourself how this bears out on APS-C. We'll look at with both the 1.4 times and the 2 times extenders, see how it performs with that. And then, of course, we'll look at a comparison on both full frame and APS-C to the 100 to 400 L Mark II with the Canon 1.4 times extender. Okay, we're going to start by looking at the 150 to 600 G2 mounted on APS-C. And I'm just going to start more towards the longer end of the focal range, starting at 400 millimeters. That's kind of where the crux is, because the lens really is quite good beyond that, and frankly you have a lot of options of reaching 300 millimeters. So let's look at 400 millimeters. So here on APS-C in the center of the frame, obviously we've got a pretty great looking image there. This is wide open, and so along the side you can see that the image quality is starting to degrade some towards the edges, just some hazing that's kind of starting to set in. On the right side, we'll see a pretty similar result. Good news is that the lens seems to be pretty well centered, and we're getting an even result. Okay, now at a little over 552 millimeters, and my experience with the first generation of the lens is that it was really strong through about 550, and that's where things started to fall apart. So we'll see if that remains true here. So in the center, once again, now you are seeing more haze, a loss of contrast starting to take place. If we look towards the side, the side really, it's a little bit less distinct in terms of some of the actual texture rendering, but it hasn't lost a lot along the sides. If anything, our performance in relation to the center is a little bit more even. Now if we go to 600 millimeters, we find that we have a pretty significant drop-off from what I can tell here. And overall, we've really lost a lot of contrast and detail rendering. And so this lens holds up better on full frame than what it does on APS-C when you look towards the edges. In fact, here, just for comparison purposes, I've mounted it on full frame 5D Mark IV, and I've put the 1.4 times extender on the 5D Mark IV. And so, obviously the compression is still a little greater for the APS-C, which is a 1.6 times crop factor on Canon compared to a 1.4. But if we compare on even and a relatively apples to apples level, you see that full frame is it's a much different kind of result by comparison, and even out towards the edges. Full frame is holding up fairly well with the extender attached. Now this is with the 2 times extender attached, and as you can see on full frame, we're still getting a pretty credible result here, all the way out towards the edges. Now I will note that this doesn't register properly. If we look in the XF data, it's showing that we're at 600 millimeters f6.3. The reality is that we're at 1200 millimeters in something like f13. And so it doesn't report right, and that's one of the quirks in using a slow maximum aperture lens with extenders. Now if we were to compare side by side, we've got the APS-C result here on the right, and so now we've got obviously even more compression in terms of the overall focal length from the full frame, which is at 1200 versus I think 960 millimeters equivalent for the APS-C, but you can see that it still favors the full frame result. Alright, one of the other things I wanted to cover on this time around is to do a direct comparison between the Tamron, and here we're at 600 millimeters on full frame compared to the 100 to 400 L Mark II with the Canon 1.4 times extender. So this is an effective focal length of 560 millimeters, so just a little bit shorter, but we can see that they're framing fairly similarly here. And so the Tamron's maximum aperture at this length is f6.3, so it's got an advantage compared to f8 for the Canon. The Canon loses a stop due to having the extender attached. However, we can see that even with the extender attached, the Canon really, it's giving a pretty flawless image there. And so a sharpness advantage here in the center goes to the Canon. If we look towards the edge here on the left side, the same is true. And over on the right side, the same is also true there. However, what happens if we make this more of an apples to apples comparison and stop the Tamron down to f8, so both of them are at f8? What we find is that obviously the Canon still looks fantastic, and I think it may have just the slightest bit more resolution. But here in the center, for field use, this is an indistinguishable result. And so I found with the previous generation 150 to 600 that the image quality really favored the Canon plus extender combination. And so here, I mean, I think that it's still, if we look along the side, the Canon is still a little bit stronger here on the right side. It's still a little bit stronger towards the left side of on the left side of the image. But the difference now is pretty minuscule overall. And if we look out towards this side, now we've got a better result here on the right side for the Tamron. But particularly in that center sharpness, the gap has really closed in the G2 version. Okay, so what happens if we throw them both on APS-C now? And so again, Canon plus 1.4 times, so 560 millimeters. I've got them both at f8. And so if we look towards the center here, we're going to find that our results are pretty much similar. However, I think there is a slight bit more texture information from the Tamron lens. And if we look towards the side, once again, I think that that's true. It's close, but I think the Tamron is giving the stronger performance overall. Over on the right side, I think the Canon is a little bit stronger. It's a little bit more even across the frame. But as you can see on APS-C, when you stop down to f8, the Tamron is giving really just as good a results as you're going to get, even a hair better than from the 100 to 400 L Mark II plus 1.4 times TC attached. Now here's a real-world comparison of the two lenses mounted on APS-C. Once again, it's the Canon 100 to 400 L Mark II plus 1.4 times, the Tamron, both right at around 552 versus 560 millimeters. And so obviously, I mean, there's a huge amount of reach on this. And so if you look at this level, it looks fine. However, you know, at a pixel level, neither image is really fantastic, but the edge here on the subject, it's slight, but a little bit to the Canon combination there. And if we look along kind of the area that's going to be the plane of focus, there's some variance, you know, here and there. I think that the Tamron's a little bit sharper through this portion of the frame compared to the Canon. You can see a little bit better contrast. Over in this section here, you know, now I would say there's maybe a slight contrast uptick for the Canon. Right towards the edge of the frame, I like the Canon result a little bit better. To be honest, neither one of these performances really wows me. I like both of these lenses better on full frame. That's kind of what they're really designed for. But for those of you that shoot APS-C, I mean, both are a credible option. Now here's a few real-world images taken on APS-C. Unfortunately, my focus calibration for this particular series of events was not dead on. You can see there's definitely some back focus here. And unfortunately, I didn't catch that until later. My software told me that everything was calibrated, but field results sometimes show otherwise, and unfortunately, that was one of these cases here. But you can see on the areas where we do have focus that it's, you know, fairly sharp overall. And of course, here, in terms of the global look of the image, it looks quite good. Now this is just a backyard image that I had taken after I discovered that the focus calibration was off, and so I just kind of did some on-the-fly field calibrations. And so you can see this is wide open, 600 millimeters, f6.3. There is a little bit of haze to the image, so contrast could be a bit better, but in terms of the overall resolution, there's a lot of detail here to work with, and of course on globally the image looks nice and sharp overall. Now I find on APS-C that basically the further you are towards the middle of the focal range, the greater sharpness that you have. And you can see on this little wild boar, this is at about 350 millimeters, that our sharpness result is really quite awesome here on a Canon 80D body. And so, you know, used correctly, you've got extra reach, but I wouldn't recommend always going right out to 600 millimeters because there you're going to get your weakest performance. Only go there if you need to. This is also now back to a 5D Mark IV, middle of the frame. This is about the middle of the focal length, and so you can see lots and lots of texture information. If, you know, used in this fashion here, you know, you can tell the individual hairs, and so a good result there. And so the lens is really strong in the middle of the focal range. Here's another one, just a hair under 500 millimeters, and so if we look at the area of focus here, we've got a lot of great detail rendering there, and look at the fine hairs along here. And so, you know, a pretty great result here along our plane of focus. Very, very nice. So here is a real-world result with the Tamron mounted with the 1.4 times Tamron teleconverter on APS-C, Canon 80D. And so, you know, frankly, this should be pretty close to best case scenario. This is on a tripod. I used a live view focus for this, and so focus is accurate, but as you can see, the resulting image quality is really quite soft. And while I don't mind the image results with the 1.4 times or even the 2 times mounted on the lens for full frame work, on APS-C, I just don't really think that that's all that a useful result. And so I would recommend, if you're shooting APS-C, just enjoy the crop factor already in your camera and just forego the extenders. Here's one final result. Now this is stopped down to f11. And so again, we're at 1344 effective millimeter length here. 1.4 times extender, 1.6 times crop factor. And so this looks a little bit better than the infinity focus distance, but still it's pretty soft overall, even stopped down here to f11 for this result. And so as you can see from my results, and probably as you can tell from the tone as we look at the images together, I definitely prefer really both of these lenses on full frame as opposed to APS-C. On APS-C, both of their limitations are exposed to some extent, and while I believe that the 100-400L Mark II probably holds up better overall on APS-C, it's just such a fantastic lens on full frame that on APS-C it's just a little bit less so. We saw where the focal length overlaps, that certainly that the lenses are more similar than they are different. And so in the middle of its focal range, the 150 to 600 is very, very strong. We also saw that when we added the 1.4 times extender and compared it to the Tamron, at equivalent apertures, it produced about the same results, basically. And so you're not necessarily gaining anything there. And of course, the challenge that you're going to have in some situations with the 100-400L plus 1.4 times extender is that it won't focus well on all Canon's bodies. If you have a 1DX or a 5D Mark IV, it will focus fantastic with the extender. On the 80D, it will focus okay, not bad, but on older bodies beyond that with the extender attached, it's not really all that fantastic. And so, anyway, I do find that for the most part, if you're going to really shoot a certain focal length regularly, in my opinion, it's better to shoot it with a bare lens rather than putting an extender. And that's particularly true when you're talking about variable aperture lenses that don't let in a huge amount of light on their telephoto ends anyway. And so overall, if you have an APS-C body and you're looking at the G2, by all means go for it. Just know that there are limitations to APS-C and there's limits to this lens on APS-C. And beyond that, as far as the extenders, I cover that more thoroughly in my episode on the extenders and how it relates to the 150 to 600. But in terms of autofocus, I have not seen any combination where it really autofocuses well with extenders attached to it. Image quality is not bad on full frame, but I really feel like it kind of falls apart on APS-C with the extenders attached. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find links to my website, to image galleries from these lenses, and then of course buying links there if you're interested in purchasing one of these lenses for yourself. If you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.